No one on that busy street had any idea what was about to happen. Not the pedestrians walking past, not the street vendors calling out their prices, not even the officer who thought he was untouchable in his uniform. Manny Pacquiao was walking casually, sunglasses on, a calm smile on his face. Fans waved, cars honked in the distance, and life moved as it always did. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary day. Just another walk through the city. But one man in uniform decided to push the wrong person. He stepped forward, smirk on his face, and tried to humiliate Manny. His words were loud, crude, and meant to embarrass, an attempt to assert dominance, to show power. At first, it seemed like just another street confrontation. A minor incident. People glanced over, some curious, some indifferent. But anyone watching closely could feel the shift in energy. The air thickened. Conversations paused. Phones were lifted, capturing the moment without anyone fully realizing how quickly it could escalate. Manny didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't react in the way most people expected. Instead, he stopped, turned, and looked at the officer with calm focus. Not anger. Not fear. Just steady, unshakable presence. The cop, seeing hesitation, smiled arrogantly. He thought Manny's calm meant weakness. He thought he had the upper hand. So he doubled down. Louder this time. Sharper. Meant to provoke a reaction. The crowd's attention sharpened. Pedestrians stopped walking. Street vendors froze mid-sentence. A few fans whispered to each other, "Is he really?" In that split second, everything changed. The ordinary street scene became charged with tension. The sense of control the officer thought he had vanished. And yet, Manny's composure didn't. It was a quiet kind of power. A presence so strong that it made the arrogant officer hesitate, just for a second. A second that felt like an eternity to everyone around. And that second was all it took to turn the entire situation upside down. Have you ever seen someone get challenged in public and completely flip the situation in seconds? Think about it. Because what you're about to witness isn't just a confrontation, it's a lesson in strength, control, and dignity. The streets were alive with the usual midday chaos. Cars honked as they threaded through traffic. Motorcycle riders weaved skillfully between lanes. Vendors shouted over the noise, selling everything from steaming street food to colorful trinkets. The smell of grilled meat mixed with the faint scent of exhaust fumes, creating a tapestry of the city's energy. Amid all this, Manny Pacquiao walked calmly, a figure of composed energy in the middle of the urban storm. Sunglasses shielded his eyes, but even behind the lenses, his focus was unmistakable. Fans noticed him immediately. Some waved, others whispered in awe, and a few gathered at a distance, trying to sneak photos without being intrusive. To them, Manny wasn't just a boxer or a senator. He was a symbol of discipline, focus, and quiet power. To everyone else on the street, it looked like just another normal day. Children ran past, chasing one another, their laughter blending with the clatter of the city. A fruit vendor arranged his baskets of mangoes and bananas while calling out prices. A street musician plucked at his guitar, adding rhythm to the symphony of urban life. Even the pigeons seemed oblivious, pecking at stray crumbs along the sidewalk. Manny's presence, however, added a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't a flashy, showy energy. It was quiet, almost unnoticeable unless you looked closely. People instinctively gave him a little more space. There was respect in the way the crowd adjusted around him, not because they feared him, but because they recognized someone who commanded attention without demanding it. Nearby, the officer stood in stark contrast. Clad in his uniform, he exuded authority, or at least he thought he did. To him, the bustling streets were a stage, and anyone who walked past him was a potential test of his control. He scanned the crowd, eyes narrowing as they landed on Manny. In his mind, this was an opportunity to assert power, to show dominance over someone who, in his assumption, would be just another citizen. The officer didn't yet know he had miscalculated. He had no idea the man in front of him was a legend, a fighter with decades of discipline, and someone who could command respect without raising his voice. He only saw a figure in sunglasses, walking confidently, appearing calm and approachable, an easy target for arrogance. Around them, life continued as usual. Street vendors stacked fresh produce in neat pyramids, shouting prices over the ambient noise. Tourists ambled along the sidewalk, phones in hand, occasionally pausing to admire the cityscape. Buses roared past, sending a wave of air across the street, scattering a few loose pieces of paper. Pedestrians bumped shoulders, apologized quickly, and kept moving. This was the kind of normal world where nothing seemed dangerous, where everyone was distracted by the noise, by their own lives. And yet, it was precisely in this calm, in this ordinary chaos, that the most extraordinary moments could happen. Manny walked with a rhythm that suggested purpose. He wasn't hurried, but every step was deliberate. There was an awareness in the way he moved, a quiet scanning of his environment that spoke of years spent in situations requiring both vigilance and control. He was present in every detail: the uneven sidewalk, the sudden horn from a car, the way a fan's phone was raised for a photo. He was aware of everything around him, yet untouched by distraction. Then there was the crowd, the background characters who would later witness everything. Street vendors paused mid-motion, sensing tension in the air even before anything happened. Passers-by slowed their pace subconsciously, their attention drawn to the subtle energy radiating from Manny. Kids on the street tugged at their parents' hands, curious about the quiet intensity that had suddenly filled the space. It was in this calm that danger could silently creep. Most conflicts don't erupt suddenly. They begin quietly, in moments where the world seems safe and ordinary. A word here, a gesture there, a misjudged glance. In a crowded, noisy world, it's easy to overlook the sparks that could ignite a storm. The officer took his first step toward Manny, a smirk forming on his face, unaware of how his next actions would disrupt the entire normalcy of the street. He was still confident, still thinking he held the power, while every person nearby remained oblivious to the fact that the stage for something extraordinary was quietly being set. And that is exactly why moments like this are so dangerous. They start in comfort, in distraction, in what seems like ordinary life. The clash between normalcy and confrontation is always more shocking because it emerges from a place where nobody expects chaos. The pedestrians, the vendors, the cars, all unaware that this ordinary day was about to turn into a story that would be shared for years. All unaware that the man in front of them, seemingly just walking down the street, was about to teach a lesson in power, discipline, and control that no one there would forget. The calm of the street held for only a few more moments. Manny Pacquiao continued walking, greeting fans with a polite nod or a quiet smile. His presence radiated calm, yet there was a readiness beneath it, a sense of awareness that made even the casual onlooker feel the subtle tension in the air. And then it happened. The officer, uniform pressed and pride swelling, took a deliberate step closer. His eyes locked on Manny as if sizing him up, as if the crowd, the fans, and the chaos around them didn't exist. He straightened his posture, lifted his chin, and with a voice meant to intimidate, he made a snide, mocking comment. It was loud, clear, and designed to humiliate. "Thought you were special, huh?" the officer sneered, tone dripping with condescension. "Just another guy on the street, like the rest of us." Pedestrians glanced over, curiosity piqued. Some froze mid-step. Street vendors paused, baskets of produce trembling slightly in their hands. A few tourists raised their phones instinctively, sensing that something was happening, but they couldn't yet tell what. Manny's reaction, or lack thereof, was striking. He didn't flinch. He didn't react with anger or fear. He simply stopped walking, his body relaxed but his focus sharp. He looked at the officer, unblinking, calm, and measured. There was no aggression in his stance, no hint of challenge. Just a quiet, unshakable presence. The officer smirked, misreading Manny's composure as hesitation, even weakness. He thought he had found an easy target. Pride swelled in his chest, arrogance filling every inch of his posture. He stepped even closer, leaning slightly, invading Manny's personal space in a deliberate attempt to provoke. "Come on," the officer taunted. "Show me who you really are. Are you just a politician now, huh? Or can you still fight?" The words were sharper now, louder, dripping with disrespect. They were meant to draw a reaction, not from the crowd, but from Manny. And for a few moments, it seemed the officer might succeed. Pedestrians instinctively backed up. Phones were lifted, recording the moment. A mother clutched her child tightly, pulling him closer. A street vendor's hands froze mid-motion, a mango almost slipping from his basket. Even the stray cats nearby paused, as if sensing the subtle tension in the air. Manny's calm gaze never wavered. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply measured the officer with his eyes, like a boxer analyzing an opponent before the first round. And then, just slowly enough to be noticed, he took a single step forward. Not in aggression, not in challenge, but enough to signal that he had seen the line, that he was aware, and that he wouldn't let disrespect go unchecked. The officer, sensing Manny's step forward, laughed, a short, sharp bark of arrogance. "Thought you were tough. Don't tell me you're scared now." And then he said something that would ignite the crowd's attention, a slur disguised as humor, a comment meant to humiliate Manny in front of everyone. The words were loud, crude, disrespectful. The street fell into a strange kind of silence. Not everyone heard the words clearly, but everyone felt the tension. The air itself seemed to thicken. Pedestrians stopped walking entirely. Fans froze, cameras hovering in mid-air. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Manny's wife, nearby, noticed the comment. She shifted slightly, her body tensing, uncomfortable with the blatant disrespect. People around began exchanging glances, a shared understanding that something extraordinary was about to unfold. And then the officer, convinced of his power, doubled down. He leaned closer, voice rising, pride now overtaking any caution. "What's the matter, old man?" he shouted, smirking. "You gonna cry?" That was the moment the line was crossed. The street, bustling seconds ago, now felt like a stage set for confrontation. The crowd's attention had shifted entirely. The normal world, the everyday rhythm of the street, was gone. It had been replaced with a silent, expectant tension that everyone could feel in their bones. Manny didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. His calm presence alone was a statement. Every eye on the street now watched him, waiting for the next move. And in that moment, the ordinary became extraordinary. The officer, blinded by arrogance, didn't yet realize that he had provoked a man who could end the situation without raising his voice, without striking a single blow. All it would take was control, and that was something the officer would soon learn the hard way. Have you ever seen someone cross a line in public, and felt that moment when the room, or the street, suddenly goes completely quiet? Imagine being there. Would you feel fear, awe, or shock? The crowd watched in tense silence. The street had transformed from a normal bustling scene into a charged stage, with Manny Pacquiao and the officer at the center of it. Pedestrians instinctively moved back, creating an invisible circle around the two men. Phones were raised, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed muted as the tension thickened. Manny stood there, calm. Not stiff, not tense, but fully aware. Every instinct honed from years in the ring, decades of discipline, and countless high-pressure situations told him exactly what he could do. He could act instantly, decisively, and end this confrontation within seconds. A single precise move, and the officer would stumble, humiliated and powerless. Yet, Manny didn't move. In that moment, the inner conflict was real and palpable. The world might have expected him to react instantly. After all, he was Manny Pacquiao. Boxer, fighter, senator, legend. People assumed that calmness meant hesitation, that control meant fear. But Manny's calm was not weakness. It was deliberate. It was strength. He looked around. The faces of pedestrians, fans, and even the vendor behind the fruit stand all reflected a mixture of curiosity, anxiety, and admiration. Some were frozen, unsure of what would happen next. Some were gripping their phones tighter, bracing for chaos. Manny's mind ran through the possible outcomes in an instant. Escalate and risk injury, or maintain control and send a lesson far greater than a single punch could ever teach. He glanced at the officer. Pride and arrogance radiated from him like heat from the midday sun. The officer's smirk was a mask for impatience, a desperate attempt to assert dominance in front of an audience that was silently judging him. Manny could see the subtle signs of uncertainty hidden behind that arrogance, the tiny flicker in the eyes, the brief hesitation in stance, but the officer would never admit it. Not yet. Then Manny's gaze shifted to his wife, standing slightly behind him. She had seen the officer's words, had felt the disrespect, and now waited silently. Her trust in Manny was evident in her eyes. She didn't need him to act with rage, she needed him to act with wisdom, to protect dignity without creating chaos. That thought solidified Manny's decision. This wasn't about proving something to the officer. This wasn't about ego. This was about control. About teaching a lesson without losing composure. About showing strength without resorting to violence. He inhaled slowly, letting the rhythm of his breath calm the instinctual tension in his body. Years of training had taught him the power of patience. Years in the ring had taught him that rushing in too quickly could turn control into chaos. Manny understood that the most dangerous opponent wasn't always the one in front of him. It was the impulsive reactions within himself. He straightened his posture, letting his presence speak louder than any words. Each movement was deliberate. Each second stretched, carrying the weight of expectation. The officer, sensing the slight change in energy, shifted subtly. For the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared. But pride immediately covered it, masking the hesitation. Manny finally spoke, his voice low, even, but filled with authority. Think carefully before you speak. This ends now, and you still have a choice. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of experience, discipline, and unshakable confidence. It was not a threat, it was a clear boundary, an invitation for the officer to step back while he still could. The crowd leaned in, subconsciously holding their breath. Phones hovered in mid-air. Even the vendors behind their stalls paused mid-motion. The tension was so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. Manny's inner conflict, though unseen, had resolved. He could feel the shift. The power had quietly transferred. Not through aggression, but through control. The officer's arrogance, once absolute, now trembled under the weight of unspoken authority. For Manny, this was a test of mastery. A real fighter doesn't just control their opponent. They first control themselves. Every heartbeat, every breath, every muscle in his body was calibrated. He was ready for what might come next, knowing he had the ability to stop it at any moment, but only if it was necessary. And that's the moment that defined the line between chaos and control. Manny Pacquiao, standing in the middle of a busy street, showed that the strongest response is not always the fastest. Sometimes the greatest power lies in patience, in discipline, in the ability to decide when to act rather than reacting blindly. The officer, still unaware of the full extent of Manny's readiness, took a final step forward. Pride made him blind. Curiosity and tension gripped the crowd. And Manny, calm, controlled, and ready, prepared to transform this disrespect into a lesson in authority, dignity, and restraint. Have you ever been in a situation where you had the power to act but chose patience instead? Could you stay calm when everyone expects you to react? Imagine what could happen if control replaced anger. The air on the street had changed. What had started as a casual walk through the bustling city had transformed into a tense standoff. Pedestrians had stopped mid-step, street vendors paused their work, and even the distant honking of traffic seemed to fade as everyone's attention centered on the two figures at the heart of the conflict, Manny Pacquiao and the officer. The officer, still filled with arrogance, decided it was time to escalate. His smirk widened, and his voice rose. "Are you scared now?" he shouted, stepping closer, invading Manny's personal space. His hand brushed slightly against Manny's shoulder, not enough to harm, but enough to provoke. Pride surged through him. He believed he had control. He was confident, convinced that no one could challenge him in front of a crowd. But Manny didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even move backward. His calm was almost unsettling. He simply met the officer's eyes with the quiet intensity of a man who had faced far greater challenges than this in his life. His stance was firm but relaxed, ready for anything without showing fear or aggression. "Step back," Manny said, his voice steady, measured, and commanding. "Apologize. This ends now." The officer paused, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but only for a split second. Pride immediately took over, pushing that hesitation aside. He leaned forward aggressively. "Or what? Are you going to hit me?" he sneered, loud enough for the small crowd that had gathered to hear. A few pedestrians murmured, some gasped. Phones hovered mid-air, capturing every word. Everyone could feel the tension radiating from the two men. The officer's arrogance filled the space, challenging Manny, testing his patience. Then, with a sharp motion, the officer shoved Manny's shoulder, not hard, but enough to draw attention. The crowd's reaction was instant. Gasps rippled through the street. People instinctively took a step back. A mother clutched her child, pulling him closer. Even the fruit vendor behind his stall froze mid-motion, a basket of mangoes wobbling precariously. Manny didn't retaliate immediately. Instead, he instinctively shifted his stance to shield himself and subtly positioned his body between the officer and his wife, who had been watching silently from the side. Every movement was precise, controlled, and deliberate. He was protecting, not attacking. The officer, convinced he had provoked a reaction, smirked. "Thought you were tough. What's the matter? Can't handle a little push?" Manny's calm eyes never left his opponent. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he slowly, deliberately moved closer, not aggressively, but just enough to indicate that the situation had reached its limit. Every step was calculated. Every breath was steady. The tension on the street was palpable. Pedestrians had stopped talking. Vendors had stopped calling out. Even stray dogs seemed to pause and watch. Everyone could sense that something was about to happen, and that it wouldn't be ordinary. Then came the moment of truth. The officer, blinded by pride and arrogance, raised his hand again, clearly intending to escalate the confrontation physically. The crowd instinctively leaned back, expecting a fight, expecting chaos. But Manny didn't fight in the way anyone imagined. Instead, in a single fluid motion, he redirected the officer's arm. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to untrained eyes, but precise, enough to break the officer's balance and stop the attack before it even began. The officer stumbled backward, surprised, off guard, his confidence crumbling instantly. The street went completely silent. Phones hovered mid-air. Pedestrians froze. Even the wind seemed to pause. No one cheered. No one laughed. Everyone simply watched in awe as Manny Pacquiao, without raising his voice, without throwing a punch, had neutralized the threat. "You don't need to be hurt to be stopped," Manny said calmly, his voice carrying through the quiet street. "You just need to be out of control." The officer, now stunned and off balance, took a few hesitant steps back. Pride and arrogance that had filled him moments before now evaporated into quiet uncertainty. He realized, finally, that control was the real power, not aggression, not intimidation. Manny didn't follow up. He didn't continue the confrontation. He didn't escalate further. His goal had never been to humiliate or harm. It had been to assert authority, protect dignity, and show that strength is measured by discipline, not rage. The crowd slowly exhaled. Some whispered to one another, trying to process what had just happened. Phones lowered. Eyes shifted from shock to admiration. Even the street vendors slowly resumed their work, a new respect lingering in the air for the quiet, controlled figure in the center. If you were standing there, watching this unfold, would you have the courage to step in, or would you freeze, unsure of what to do? Could you remain calm in the face of blatant disrespect? The street was frozen in anticipation. Every pedestrian, every vendor, every bystander held their breath, silently waiting for what would happen next. The officer's arrogance, once loud and threatening, had begun to waver. His shove had failed to provoke Manny Pacquiao, and the subtle stumble had shaken his confidence more than he realized. But pride doesn't die easily, it only waits for a chance to strike again. He straightened his uniform, trying to mask the uncertainty that now crept into his posture. "You think you're in control?" he sneered, though his voice carried less certainty than before. He raised his hand again, ready to escalate the confrontation, fully expecting Manny to react physically this time. But Manny's eyes never wavered. Calm, focused, and unshakable, he assessed the officer with the quiet precision of a man who had faced countless challenges in life, both in and out of the ring. Every breath, every heartbeat, every small muscle adjustment was intentional. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to strike. He had already decided how this encounter would end, on his terms, with control, not chaos. "You still have time," Manny said quietly, his voice carrying authority without aggression. There was no threat, only the unmistakable power of restraint. The crowd felt it, the difference between someone who fights out of anger and someone who controls the situation with complete mastery. The officer hesitated, a flicker of doubt breaking through his mask of bravado. But his pride fought the hesitation. He stepped forward, again raising his hand, fully intent on asserting dominance. This was his final chance, or so he thought. Manny acted, but not like anyone expected. In one fluid, precise motion, he redirected the officer's arm. It was subtle, almost invisible to untrained eyes, but devastatingly effective. The officer's balance shifted instantly, his hand no longer capable of striking. His eyes widened in shock. He stumbled back, unprepared for the sudden, controlled force that had neutralized his aggression without causing him harm. The crowd gasped. Phones hovered mid-air. Pedestrians froze mid-step. Even the vendors behind their stalls stopped moving, silently absorbing the power of the moment. There was no chaos, no screaming, no violence, yet the lesson had been made perfectly clear. "You don't need to be hurt to be stopped," Manny said calmly, each word deliberate. "You just need to be out of control." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The simplicity of the words, combined with the calm authority of Manny's presence, resonated more than any yell, more than any physical blow ever could. The officer, now visibly shaken, realized he had been outmatched, not by strength, not by speed, but by discipline and control. For the first time, he hesitated entirely. His arrogance was gone, replaced by confusion and a reluctant respect. Pride, which had fueled his initial aggression, now felt hollow. He took a tentative step back, the invisible circle of authority Manny had created expanding naturally. Manny didn't pursue him. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. He stood calmly, breathing steadily, fully composed, and entirely in control. His wife, who had been watching silently, could finally relax. Pedestrians and fans slowly exhaled, their tension turning into awe. The street returned to its normal rhythm, but the energy had changed. The lesson had been delivered. Control had proven stronger than aggression, calm had defeated arrogance, and dignity had prevailed without a single act of unnecessary violence. Even the small details reinforced the lesson. A vendor adjusted his stall more carefully, a child whispered to his parent about what he saw, and smartphones lowered from recording to silent admiration. The power of discipline, of controlled authority, was palpable in the air, more impactful than any chaotic outburst could have been. Manny glanced at the officer one last time, eyes steady, unwavering. "Remember," he said softly, "it's never about hurting someone. It's about knowing the line, and standing on the right side of it." The officer, finally silent, looked away, his body language now apologetic without words. The lesson had been learned without humiliation, without harm, only through the quiet, undeniable authority of someone who had mastered both body and mind. Anger may look powerful. Aggression may feel like control. But true strength, the kind that earns respect instantly, comes from discipline, patience, and the ability to end a confrontation without chaos. That's what separates someone who fights with impulse from someone who commands with presence. The crowd, now relaxed but still mesmerized, slowly resumed their routines. Vendors returned to their work, children continued to play, and the traffic resumed its familiar rhythm. But no one would forget the lesson delivered in those few seconds. Strength is quiet, control is authority, and dignity is far more powerful than rage. Have you ever witnessed someone handle a situation like this, with control, calm, and precision, without a single act of violence? Could you respond like Manny if you were in the middle of the chaos? The street slowly returned to life. Pedestrians began moving again, hesitant at first, but curiosity and relief blended into the rhythm of the city. Vendors resumed their work, calling out prices and arranging produce. Children's laughter returned to the sidewalks, and the hum of traffic slowly rose, filling the space where tension had reigned just moments before. Yet, for everyone who had witnessed it, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. The calm, controlled authority of Manny Pacquiao had left an indelible mark. It wasn't the officer's shove, or the raised hand, or even the crude words that people remembered, it was what didn't happen. There was no chaotic fight, no loud argument, no spectacle of violence. Instead, there had been a lesson in strength, dignity, and discipline that no one could forget. The officer stood a few steps away, his face pale and eyes wide. Pride had been stripped from him, not through force, but through the quiet authority of someone who understood the true meaning of power. Every fiber of his body signaled hesitation, uncertainty, and the first seeds of regret. He had underestimated the man in front of him. He had assumed control, only to find that strength was not loud, it was not aggressive, it was deliberate, measured, and unshakable. Manny finally turned to his wife, who had remained calm but visibly tense throughout the encounter. He offered a soft smile. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle yet full of reassurance. She nodded, the tension leaving her shoulders. In that moment, their bond, the trust between them, was highlighted even more vividly than the confrontation itself. Fans and pedestrians began to whisper among themselves. Phones, still raised, now lowered slowly. The crowd shared glances that said, without words, "We just witnessed something extraordinary." They weren't talking about the officer. They were talking about Manny. About how a single person, calm and controlled, had transformed an aggressive, potentially violent encounter into a lesson in dignity. Security and nearby authorities had begun to intervene, guiding the officer away from the scene. His friends, who had been standing at a distance, suddenly appeared embarrassed, reluctant, and finally compliant. What had started as arrogance ended in quiet humility. There were no cheers, no applause, only the collective recognition of something rare: power without violence. Even as the streets slowly returned to normal, social media had already begun buzzing. Someone's phone had captured the entire encounter. The video spread quickly, not because of a shocking fight, but because of the lesson it carried. Comments poured in: "This is what true strength looks like, discipline over rage. We need more people like Manny in the world." The story went viral, not because someone had been attacked, but because someone had demonstrated control in the face of provocation. Manny didn't linger for attention. He walked calmly, maintaining his poise, returning to his day as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everyone who had witnessed the event knew it had been extraordinary. The lesson had been delivered in a single, controlled encounter. Real strength is quiet, deliberate, and disciplined. Rage is loud. Strength is silent. For those watching, the impact lingered. People reflected on their own lives. How often had they let anger dictate their actions? How often had they escalated situations unnecessarily? Manny's display was more than a lesson in self-defense. It was a lesson in humanity, in patience, and in the power of self-control. By the next morning, the video was everywhere. On social media feeds, in group chats, and on news sites. The discussion wasn't about humiliation or violence. It was about respect. About the rare ability to stand strong without aggression, to defend oneself and others while maintaining dignity. That day, thousands learned a lesson that could not be taught by shouting or fighting. It had to be witnessed. Manny Pacquiao had proven something unforgettable. The strongest person in the room is not always the loudest. Not the fastest, not the most aggressive. It is the one who commands respect without losing control, the one who protects others with calm authority, and the one who knows that power is measured by restraint, not rage. If you believe real strength comes from discipline and control, type respect in the comments. Would you have had the courage to remain calm in that moment? Could you handle confrontation without losing control? The street had returned to its rhythm, but the lesson lingered. In the chaos of everyday life, there would always be moments where anger, arrogance, or disrespect could spark conflict. But Manny's example proved that the way to truly command respect, and to protect oneself and others, is not through retaliation or shouting, but through control, discipline, and calm authority. And for everyone who witnessed it, that day would remain unforgettable.